Blake Harrison had always been the man who won. At 35, he wasn't just rich, he was wealthy. With a sprawling mansion overlooking the California coast, a garage packed with luxury sports cars, and a net worth that could silence any room. As the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the U.S., Blake had mastered the art of control, power, and influence. He knew how to bend situations and people to his will, thriving on challenges like an athlete chasing adrenaline. But beneath the glamorous surface, Blake was bored. The expensive suits, lavish parties, and people constantly seeking his attention had lost their thrill. Winning no longer felt like winning. Yet, his ego refused to admit that something was missing. For Blake, life had always been a game of victories, and he intended to keep his perfect record intact. One lazy Saturday afternoon, Blake and his friends gathered at a McDonald's for a bit of ironic entertainment. Sitting in a booth near the back, they chuckled as they watched families, teenagers, and tired workers stream in and out of the fast food joint. For Blake and his wealthy companions, this was a glimpse into a world they had long outgrown. The smell of fries and the sticky tables were as foreign as a different planet. Caleb Turner, one of Blake's oldest and most competitive friends, leaned back and smirked as he bit into his burger. "You've done it all, Blake," Caleb said, wiping ketchup off his fingers. "Millionaire by 30. So, women falling over you. But I bet you can't win this next one." Blake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's the challenge, Caleb?" Caleb's grin widened as he nodded toward a nearby waitress cleaning tables. "See her?" he asked, lowering his voice. "Rachel Miller. Single mom, works here full-time. She's as ordinary as it gets. I bet you $2 million you can't get her to marry you. No tricks, no contracts, just a real marriage." Blake followed his gaze to Rachel, a woman wearing the signature red and yellow McDonald's uniform. Her light brown hair was tied in a ponytail, and she moved efficiently from table to table, collecting trash and wiping down surfaces. Her face looked tired but determined, her eyes carrying a quiet strength that intrigued him. Rachel Miller, 28, was the type of woman Blake wouldn't have noticed under normal circumstances. She wasn't decked out in designer clothes or vying for attention. To most people in Blake's world, she would have been invisible. But for Blake, who thrived on winning, this bet was too enticing to pass up. $2 million, Blake repeated, raising his soda cup as a toast. "Caleb, you're making this too easy." Caleb chuckled. "We'll see." Blake leaned back in his seat, confidence radiating off him. He had no idea that Rachel Miller would be the challenge that would change his life forever. The waitress passed by, barely glancing at him as she picked up a tray from the table next to theirs. "I'll be seeing you again soon, Rachel," Blake thought to himself, already strategizing. This wasn't just about the money, it never had been. For Blake, the thrill of winning was the only prize that mattered. And right now Rachel Miller was the ultimate game. Blake wasn't used to rejection. But that's exactly what he got when he first approached Rachel. After finishing his meal, he waited until she was clearing a nearby table and flashed his signature smile. The same smile that had closed multi-million-dollar deals and charmed models and CEOs alike. "Rachel, right?" he asked, leaning casually against the table. She glanced at him, her expression neutral. "Yeah. Can I help you with something?" "I'm Blake," he said smoothly. "I was thinking maybe we could grab a coffee sometime." "You seem interesting." Rachel blinked, clearly unimpressed. "Sorry, I'm working." Blake chuckled unfazed. "Not right now, obviously. But you must have a day off. We could chat a little, get to know each other." Rachel stared at him, her gaze firm but polite. "I'm really busy, and I don't have time for casual meetups." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, surprised. Blake frowned, the rejection stinging more than he expected. It wasn't just about his ego. There was something about her resistance that intrigued him. She didn't care who he was. She wasn't impressed by the way he carried himself or the casual charm that had always worked in the past. This wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. But that only made him more determined. "I'm persistent, Rachel," Blake murmured under his breath as he watched her return to the counter. "You'll find that out soon enough." That night, as he drove back to his mansion, Blake replayed the encounter in his head. Rachel Miller wasn't like anyone he had ever pursued. She was practical, guarded, and fiercely independent. If he wanted to win this bet, he'd have to change his approach. No flashy gestures, no smooth-talking shortcuts. He would need to make her trust him. And for the first time in years, Blake felt something he hadn't felt since he started playing the game of power, genuine excitement. The following Tuesday, Blake returned to the same McDonald's at the same time. This time, he watched Rachel from a distance before making his move. She worked methodically, cleaning trays and delivering orders, her expression calm and focused. There was something admirable about her resilience, something that made him want to understand her life beyond the surface. When she finally approached his table to take his order, Blake smiled warmly. "Hey, Rachel. I thought maybe you'd be expecting me?" Rachel raised an eyebrow, not hiding her surprise. "Didn't know you came here so often." "Well, I think I'll start coming more," he said, leaning forward playfully. "Great service and all." Rachel let out a small laugh, but it was more disbelief than amusement. "Let me guess, same order as last time?" "Actually, no," Blake said, leaning back. "How about this? You give me your recommendation and I'll try it. Then we can discuss it over coffee." He grinned, hoping his playful persistence would wear her down. Rachel sighed, jotting down his order before turning to leave. "I'm not sure you're going to get the answer you're looking for." "I'm okay with that," Blake replied confidently. "I'm patient." It was a small exchange, but it gave him insight into how she operated. Rachel wasn't someone who could be rushed or easily impressed. She had her priorities, and casual flings with strangers weren't on her list. But Blake wasn't a stranger who gave up easily. A few days later, he saw his chance when Rachel finished her shift. He waited outside the restaurant, leaning casually against his car as she stepped out the door. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the street, and Rachel, with her hair slightly messy from the long day, looked exhausted. "Rachel," Blake called, stepping forward. She stopped, visibly surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Just thought I'd catch you before you headed home," he said, keeping his tone light. "How about that coffee now?" Rachel hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. She looked tired, but there was something in Blake's eyes that made her pause. "Fine," she said after a moment, sighing. "But just a quick coffee. I have to pick up my daughter soon." Blake smiled, trying to contain his excitement. "That's all I'm asking for." At a small cafe down the street, Rachel sat across from Blake, visibly uncomfortable but polite. She ordered a plain black coffee, while Blake opted for something fancier. "So," he began, stirring his drink, "how long have you worked at McDonald's?" "A few years," Rachel answered, her tone guarded. "It's how I support my daughter, Chloe." Blake leaned forward, intrigued. "That's a lot of responsibility for one person. How do you manage everything?" Rachel let out a humorless laugh. "Barely. Between work and taking care of Chloe, there's not much time for anything else." She took a sip of her coffee, then looked at him skeptically. "And what about you, Blake? What do you do besides showing up at fast food restaurants to bother waitresses?" Blake smiled, impressed by her bluntness. "I'm the CEO of a tech company." She nodded, as if that explained everything. "Thought so. You don't exactly blend in here." He chuckled, but her words struck a chord. "Maybe that's why I wanted to meet you. You're not part of my world, and that's refreshing." Rachel shook her head, her expression unreadable. "People like you don't usually stay interested in people like me for long." Blake's confidence wavered for a split second. "Maybe I'm different," he said softly. Rachel let out a sigh and finished her coffee. "We'll see." She stood up, grabbing her bag. "Thanks for the coffee, Blake. But like I said, I don't have time for games." Blake watched her leave, a mixture of frustration and fascination swirling inside him. This was supposed to be a simple bet, but Rachel's honesty and strength were making it personal. He wasn't just playing to win anymore, he wanted to understand her. As she disappeared into the evening crowd, Blake leaned back in his chair, determined. This wasn't over. Blake found himself returning to McDonald's more often in the following weeks, but this time, it wasn't about strategy. It wasn't even about the bet. There was something about Rachel's resilience and sincerity that had burrowed into his mind and refused to leave. She wasn't charmed by his wealth, and she didn't give him the easy victory he was used to. Rachel challenged him, and that intrigued him more than any deal he had ever made. Their conversations grew longer and more personal, though Rachel kept a cautious distance. Blake learned that her daughter, Chloe, was the center of her world, and everything Rachel did was for her. Her love for Chloe wasn't something she needed to boast about. It was evident in every word, every story, every moment she talked about her. Chloe was her driving force, and that dedication stirred something unfamiliar in Blake: admiration. One evening, after Rachel's shift, Blake offered to walk her to the bus stop. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. As they strolled through the quiet streets, the sun dipping below the horizon, their conversation took a turn Blake hadn't expected. "You're persistent," Rachel said, glancing at him. "Most guys would have given up by now." Blake smirked. "I don't give up on things that matter." "And you think I matter?" she asked, her tone skeptical but curious. "I know you do," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "You've built a life for yourself and your daughter with nothing but hard work and determination. That's rare." Rachel stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his for any sign of insincerity. "Why are you doing this, Blake? What do you really want?" Blake hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He couldn't tell her about the bet, at least not yet. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if the bet was the reason anymore. "I want to know you," he said truthfully. "The real you, not just the waitress or the single mom. I want to know what makes you smile when you're not worried about work or Chloe. I want to know what you dream about." Rachel's expression softened, and for a moment, the guarded walls she had built seemed to crack. But just as quickly, she pulled them back up. "I haven't thought about my dreams in a long time," she admitted quietly. Blake's chest tightened at her honesty. "Maybe it's time you did," he said. Their conversation lingered in Rachel's mind that night. As she tucked Chloe into bed and sat by the window of her tiny apartment, she found herself wondering if Blake really was different, or if he was just another man pretending to care. She wanted to trust him, but her life had taught her to be cautious. Trusting the wrong person could lead to heartbreak, and she couldn't afford that, not with Chloe depending on her. But Blake wasn't giving up. A few days later, he invited Rachel and Chloe to a local park for a picnic. Rachel hesitated but accepted, mostly for Chloe's sake. She knew her daughter needed more moments of joy, and she was willing to give Blake a chance to provide that, just this once. The park was filled with the sound of laughter and rustling leaves as children played on the swings and families picnicked on the grass. Blake spread out a blanket under a shady tree and unpacked the sandwiches he had prepared himself, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by Rachel. Chloe ran across the grass, chasing a butterfly, while Rachel sat beside Blake, her guard still up but slightly lowered. "You made these?" she asked, biting into a sandwich. Blake grinned. "Surprising, right? I figured I'd try something new." Rachel chuckled, a genuine laugh that made Blake's heart skip. "You're full of surprises." They spent the afternoon talking about small things, music, books, childhood memories. And for the first time, Rachel allowed herself to relax around him. She saw glimpses of a different side of Blake, one that wasn't the polished, confident CEO, but a man who was trying to connect on a deeper level. When Chloe ran back to them, giggling as she tripped onto the blanket, Blake scooped her up and spun her around, both of them laughing. Rachel watched them, her heart warming at the sight. In that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Blake genuinely cared. But caring wasn't enough to erase the doubts in her heart. As they packed up the picnic and walked back to the car, Rachel knew she was at a crossroads. Blake was making her feel things she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope, excitement, vulnerability. And that terrified her. "Thanks for today," Rachel said softly as Blake opened the car door for her. "Chloe had a great time." Blake smiled, but there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "What about you? Did you have a good time?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I did." As they drove back to her apartment, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Blake was more than what he seemed. But she also knew that letting him in completely would mean risking everything. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that yet. The turning point came on a quiet evening when Rachel invited Blake over for dinner at her apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, but it was a gesture of trust to step forward. Blake showed up early, dressed casually, with a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. Rachel smiled when she opened the door, but it was a cautious smile, one that reminded him she was still waiting for proof that he was serious. Inside, Chloe darted across the living room, excited to see him. "Blake, look what I made at school today," she exclaimed, holding up a colorful drawing of a family, Rachel, Chloe, and a man who looked suspiciously like Blake. Blake knelt down to take a closer look. "This is amazing, Chloe. I didn't know I was part of the family portrait." Chloe giggled. "You come around a lot. Mom says you're a friend." Rachel, standing by the kitchen counter, felt her cheeks flush. "Chloe, don't embarrass him." "I'm not embarrassed," Blake said, looking at Rachel with a warmth that made her stomach flutter. "I'm honored." As they sat down for dinner, the conversation was light, filled with laughter and stories about Chloe's school antics. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt something she had almost forgotten: peace. She watched Blake interact with Chloe, the way he listened intently and laughed at her silly jokes. This wasn't the Blake she had met at McDonald's, the one who seemed too polished to be real. This Blake felt genuine, present, and sincere. After dinner, Rachel sent Chloe to bed and joined Blake on the small couch in the living room. The air between them was quiet but heavy, like they both knew something was coming. Blake leaned back, glancing around the cozy apartment. It wasn't much, Rachel knew that, but it was home, and she was proud of the life she had built here, even if it wasn't perfect. "You've done an incredible job with Chloe," Blake said, breaking the silence. "She's happy, confident, and so full of life." "That's because of you." Rachel's gaze softened, but her defenses weren't completely down. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, "but everything I do is for her." Blake nodded, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "I want to be part of that, Rachel. For both of you. I know I'm not perfect, and I come from a world that's complicated. But I'm serious about you. About us." Rachel's heart pounded as she absorbed his words. She wanted to believe him so badly, but there was still that lingering fear, the voice in her head warning her to be careful. "Blake, what happens when you get bored?" she asked quietly. "What happens when you realize this life isn't glamorous enough for you?" Blake reached for her hand, gently intertwining their fingers. "I'm not here for the glamour. I'm here because you've shown me something I've never had before, something real. I don't want to go back to the life I had. I want this life, with you and Chloe." Rachel searched his face, looking for any sign of dishonesty. But all she saw was vulnerability, the kind she didn't expect from someone like him. Slowly, she let herself relax into the moment, resting her head on his shoulder as the weight of her doubts began to lift. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Blake was telling the truth. But deep down, she knew the scars of her past wouldn't heal overnight. If she was going to trust him, it had to be one step at a time. As they sat together in the dimly lit room, the warmth of his presence enveloping her, Rachel whispered, "Okay, Blake. Let's try." Blake smiled, relief washing over him as he held her hand tighter. "I won't let you down." For that moment, Rachel believed him. But neither of them knew that the past was about to resurface, and this fragile hope would be tested in ways neither of them could have predicted. The next few weeks were filled with warmth and small steps forward. Blake spent more time at Rachel's apartment, helping Chloe with her homework, cooking dinner, and sharing quiet moments on the couch with Rachel after Chloe went to bed. The connection between them deepened, and for once, Blake felt at peace with the simplicity of life. No lavish parties, no business deals, just the sound of laughter and the warmth of family. But peace never lasts, when secrets lurk beneath the surface. One evening, as Blake was cleaning up after dinner, his phone buzzed on the counter. Rachel, who was folding laundry in the living room, barely noticed until she heard Blake's voice shift from casual to tense. She turned, catching the way his shoulders stiffened. "Caleb, what do you want?" Blake said, his tone sharp. Rachel stood quietly, listening as Blake's old friend chuckled on the other end of the line. "Relax, Blake. Just calling to see how my favorite winner is doing. Did you collect your $2 million yet, or is she still playing hard to get?" Rachel froze. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her mind raced, piecing together what she had just heard. $2 million? Playing hard to get? Blake's eyes darted toward Rachel as he realized she was listening. His face paled. "Caleb, I'll call you back," he said quickly, hanging up. "Blake," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "What was that?" Blake set his phone down, panic settling in his chest. "Rachel, I can't explain." "Explain what?" she demanded, stepping forward. "What did Caleb mean about $2 million? Is this a joke to you?" Her voice cracked, her body shaking as she tried to make sense of the betrayal flooding her veins. Blake took a step closer, hands raised as if to calm her. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. At first, yes, there was a bet, but it was stupid. I didn't think." Rachel's eyes widened, the truth crashing over her. "A bet," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Our entire relationship is a bet." "No," Blake said quickly, his voice desperate. "It started that way, but it's not like that anymore. I swear. I care about you and Chloe. This is real for me now." But Rachel shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How could you? How could you pretend to care about me and my daughter while this was just some game to you?" Blake felt his chest tighten, the weight of his lies suffocating him. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Rachel. I was arrogant and I made a mistake. But I've changed. You've changed me. Changed you." Rachel laughed bitterly through her tears. "You think that's enough? I trusted you, Blake. I let you into my life, into Chloe's life. And the whole time you were just trying to win some bet." She stepped back, shaking her head as if trying to shake off the betrayal. "Get out. Rachel, please." "I said get out," she yelled, her voice breaking. Blake hesitated, his heart shattering as he watched the woman he had grown to love push him away. But he knew this wasn't a battle he could win with words. Slowly, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Before he left, he turned back, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'll prove to you this wasn't just a game," he said quietly. "No matter how long it takes, I'll prove it." But Rachel didn't respond. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, tears streaming down her face as the door closed behind him. That night, as Rachel sat alone on the couch, holding one of Chloe's stuffed animals for comfort, her heart ached with a mixture of betrayal and longing. She had opened herself up to love, to hope, and it had been torn apart. Blake, meanwhile, drove aimlessly through the city, guilt consuming him. He had spent years chasing wins, but this was the first time he realized the cost of playing the game. And this time, he wasn't sure if he could fix what he had broken. The next morning, Rachel woke up with a tear-streaked face and an empty heart. Chloe, too young to understand what had happened, asked where Blake was. "He's gone for now," Rachel whispered, holding her daughter close. But inside, she wondered if she had made the right decision, or if she could ever forgive him. Meanwhile, Blake sat in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline, knowing that if he wanted any chance at redemption, he'd have to prove that his love for Rachel and Chloe was real. And this time, It wasn't about winning a bet. It was about proving that he had become the man they deserved. But the question haunted him. Would Rachel ever believe him again? The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of silence and reflection. Rachel avoided Blake's calls, texts, and emails, leaving him in a state of painful uncertainty. But this time, he didn't give in to his usual instincts. He didn't try to fix everything overnight or win her back with grand gestures. He knew better now. Rachel wouldn't be swayed by words or gifts. Instead, he made a decision that would change everything. Blake met with his board of directors, signed papers, and relinquished control of his company. It was the core of his identity, the empire that had defined him for years, but he realized it had also been the root of the person he no longer wanted to be. Without hesitation, he sold his shares and donated a significant portion of his wealth to a community fund, specifically to help struggling single parents, just like Rachel had once been. When the final paperwork was signed, Blake didn't feel loss. He felt relief. The next day, Blake drove to Rachel's apartment. He knew showing up unannounced was risky, but he couldn't wait any longer. Standing outside her door, he took a deep breath and knocked softly. Rachel opened the door cautiously, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Blake, I thought I made it clear." "I know," he said, holding up his hands. "I'm not here to force you into anything. I just need you to hear me out one last time." She hesitated before nodding and stepping aside. Inside, the apartment felt colder than it had before. Chloe's toys were scattered on the floor, but the warmth and laughter Blake had grown used to were gone. Rachel crossed her arms and leaned against the wall, keeping her distance. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Say what you need to say." Blake took a step forward, his gaze steady. "I sold my company." Her brows furrowed in confusion. "What?" "I walked away from everything that tied me to the person I used to be," he explained. "I donated a large part of the money to a support fund for single parents. I'm starting over because I want to be the man you deserve, not the man who hurt you." Rachel's breath hitched, but she remained silent. "I know an apology isn't enough," Blake continued, his voice cracking. "I know you might never trust me again, but I couldn't let you believe this was just a game to me. I didn't walk away from you because of the bet. I walked away because I'm in love with you, Rachel. And that's the only thing I'm here to prove." Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. "Why now, Blake? Why do all of this after the damage has already been done?" "Because losing you made me realize that winning doesn't mean anything if you have no one to share it with," he said, stepping closer. "You and Chloe showed me what really matters, and for the first time, I'm not chasing a victory. I'm chasing a life, a real one." Rachel's walls, which she had carefully built back up after the betrayal, began to crack. She could see it in his eyes. This wasn't the arrogant man who had entered McDonald's on a dare. This was someone who had stripped away everything to prove his sincerity. But could she let herself believe him again? "Blake," she whispered, her voice shaking, "I'm scared. I trusted you once, and you broke me. I don't know if I can go through that again." Blake closed the distance between them, gently taking her hands in his. "You don't have to trust me right away. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I've changed. I'm not going anywhere, Rachel, not until you believe it." Rachel let out a sob and buried her face in her hands. The weight of the past months came crashing down on her. But mixed with the pain was something else, hope. She had tried to push him away, but even after everything, she still cared. She wanted to believe that he could be the man she needed. After a moment, she lifted her head and met his gaze. "I don't know how long it'll take," she said softly. "But if you're willing to try, so am I." Blake's chest swelled with emotion as he nodded, his grip on her hands tightening. "I'll wait as long as you need." For the first time since the betrayal, Rachel allowed herself to lean into him, her head resting against his chest. And for the first time, Blake felt the weight of redemption. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. The months that followed were filled with small steps and careful progress. Blake showed up consistently, not with grand gestures, but with meaningful actions. He helped Rachel with Chloe's school drop-offs, cooked dinners when she worked late shifts, and spent weekends working on the community project he had founded for single parents. Each day, he earned back a piece of her trust. For Rachel, healing wasn't easy. There were nights when doubt crept in, memories of the betrayal threatening to pull her back into the pain. But each time she saw Blake helping Chloe with her homework or quietly fixing the broken faucet in her apartment without being asked, she realized this version of him was real. He wasn't trying to win her over. He was building a life alongside her. One cool autumn evening, Blake invited Rachel and Chloe to a modest housewarming dinner at his new home, a small, cozy house he had bought with his remaining savings. The once lavish lifestyle was gone, but Blake didn't care. This house was the symbol of his fresh start. And tonight, he wanted Rachel to see the life they could have together. The table was set simply, with candles flickering and the smell of homemade lasagna filling the room. Chloe helped set the plates while Rachel watched, her heart warming at the sight. After dinner, they sat in the living room, Chloe curled up in a blanket, dozing off as Blake read her a bedtime story. Rachel sat beside them, her gaze soft as she watched the man who had once been a stranger now become part of her family. When Chloe finally fell asleep, Blake gently carried her to the guest bedroom and returned to find Rachel standing by the window, looking out at the quiet street. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the streetlights outside. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about us. About everything we've been through." Blake's heart pounded, but he stayed quiet, letting her speak. "You've proven a lot to me these past months," she continued. "Not with words, but with actions. I see how much you've changed, how much you've given up to be here with me and Chloe. And I know that wasn't easy for you." He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't a sacrifice, Rachel. It was the best decision I ever made." Tears welled in her eyes, and she let out a shaky breath. "I was so scared of believing in you again, but you've shown me that love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real. And what we have is real." Blake cupped her face gently, brushing away a tear with his thumb. "I love you, Rachel. I love Chloe. And I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you." Rachel smiled through her tears, her heart finally at peace. "I believe you." Blake leaned in and kissed her, the moment warm and full of promise, not of perfection, but of a future built on trust, forgiveness, and love. The following spring, they held a small wedding ceremony in the park where they had once shared a picnic. Chloe was the flower girl, tossing petals down the aisle as Blake and Rachel exchanged vows, not out of obligation or a bet, but from a place of genuine love and commitment. A year later, their family grew with the birth of their baby boy, whose arrival filled their home with even more joy. Chloe adored her little brother, and Blake marveled at the life they had built together, a life far richer than any wealth he had once possessed. One evening, as the family sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Rachel leaned her head on Blake's shoulder. "You really did prove me wrong," she whispered with a smile. Blake kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "I'm glad I did." And in that quiet moment, as Chloe played with her baby brother on the grass and the cool breeze rustled the trees, Blake knew he had found something worth more than any bet, fortune, or victory. He had found home,